Welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. I'm Patrick Cummings here with E.C. Sinkowski. Each week, we simplify the principles and practices of nutrition, health, and fitness that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Good. What's going on with you?
Oh, living the dream. Living the dream. We're doing good. We're going to
talk nutrition.
We're going to talk nutrition. We're going to talk about specifically CrossFitters nutrition.
Okay.
You and I have been doing CrossFit since approximately, 1984? That's what it feels like when I was 3.
January 1st, 2006.
Good for you. We probably started right around the same time. And in the same place. I don't know if everybody knows that about us. So you and I met way back in the way back days at the old CrossFit Boston when there was like 4 CrossFit gyms in the world.
Correct.
That's how long we've known each other.
Correct.
But we are going to talk about specifically some new stuff that's come out as it relates to CrossFit and nutrition, or CrossFitters and nutrition. So let's maybe do a little bit of background and where this idea came from and why we're talking about it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit on some of the stuff through various podcasts, of course, but somebody sent me a recent article that was looking at nutrition specific to CrossFit. It's this Martinho study in the show notes. And, relatively speaking, CrossFit's a pretty new sports paradigm, even though you and I have been doing it for quite some time, that there really, especially in the early years, those 2006, 2010, there really wasn't any research on it. And now there actually is some research directly on CrossFit, which is pretty cool. So this is an article that was released in June, and it's kind of summarizing the findings from all of these CrossFit specific studies. Now, I'll let the cat out of the bag now. I think still more research needs to be done to conclusively say a lot of things that I think people want to hear, but I thought it would be kind of cool to review the state of the evidence, the state of the science. The first is really they were research that are kind of questionnaires to CrossFitters, asking them about their diets, what they eat, what supplements they take. The second type of research they looked at was interventions to see how diet affects CrossFit performance, which I think is probably the most interesting of the lot. And then the third is interventions in terms of like supplements that could affect CrossFit performance. So that's what this article covered and we're going to talk about.
Fantastic. Okay. So questionnaires, intervention, and supplements. Maybe let's just go down that list and do questionnaires first. What have we learned? What did you learn about questionnaires?
Yeah, it looks like there's been 23 total studies of these questionnaires, and they could have just been food frequency questionnaires where people check off, this is how often I eat protein, or even recall where they meet with somebody and say, this is what I ate in the last 24 hours type of thing. Now, only 9 of those 23 questionnaires were specific to diet, where the remainder of them really focused on supplements, which is interesting. So overwhelming majority were kind of surveying supplement use. And I think it's also good to remind ourselves that these types of questionnaires and surveys are going to be subject to error. Definitely in terms of underreporting. The participants want their diet to appear in a certain way, especially if you're sitting with somebody on like a one-on-one interview with a recall or even a food frequency questionnaire, to be, quote, more clean or better than they think it is, or just even forgetfulness. It's not always done intentionally by any means. And so I think it's important that when you're looking at the data and what they find with these surveys is to understand that it's probably a little bit removed from reality. For example, the women on average report taking in about 1,750 calories per day, and the men on average report about taking on 2,350 calories per day. Those intakes to me, just off the cuff, sound a bit low. And I think that reflects a little bit of underreporting that's happening. Now, the authors actually call out these intakes and say that this seems like these athletes are under eating a bit. But again, I think it might not be accurate. It might just be more a reflection of the fact that underreporting on average is about 20%. And so if we kind of take that into account, it would put the women closer to 2,100 calories per day and the men closer to 2,800 calories a day, which, to be honest, sounds more realistic for me. But anyway, that was what they were kind of reporting intake-wise. The average protein intake that they were reporting is that CrossFitters are taking in a little bit higher than my 0.7 gram per pound level that I recommend, actually a little bit closer to the 0.8 grams per pound. So CrossFitters are getting enough protein. And then carb intake was averaging about 3.6 grams per kilogram, which for a 150-pound person would be taking in about 250 grams of carbohydrate a day, which I believe, based on my experience within the community and working with clients, probably is actually pretty close to the average of what CrossFitters are eating. Now, the authors of the article actually call this out and believe it's too low. This is going to come as a big surprise, I think, to a lot of people in our audience, but typical carbohydrate recommendations, especially for athletes, is often in the 6 to 12 grams per kilogram range. And remember, based on the surveys I just said, the CrossFitters are averaging 3.6 grams per kilogram, so about half of the low end. Now, yes, this could be subject to the underreporting that I just mentioned, but I do think CrossFitters as a community tend to bias more on the lower carbohydrate, higher fat side of things than kind of traditional athletics. But just to kind of give an example of where the authors would recommend these athletes would be, for a 150-pound person, 6 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate ends up being about 410 grams of carbohydrate a day. And at the upper end would be closer to 800 grams of carbohydrate a day. And so again, the surveys are putting people closer to 250 grams of carbohydrate a day, which I think is pretty close to where people are. And I would say, in terms of what the authors think about this lower carbohydrate intake, I both kind of agree and disagree with them in that I'm not convinced that CrossFitters need to be at as high as, like, let's say 400 grams per day. So in that sense, I disagree with them, especially when we're looking at the once a day kind of recreational CrossFitters. But I also agree with them in the sense that I think there's this idea that we're going to get to in the CrossFit community that keto is this superior diet, and that I certainly disagree with. That somebody in the 250, 300 grams carbohydrate a day range, assuming their overall diet quantity is correct, I think is actually going to put them in a better spot performance-wise, health-wise, and even sustainability-wise that we'll discuss. Oh, one more thing is they also asked about the supplements, of course, and the most reported supplements were protein and creatine, which totally makes sense with what I know about our audience. So that is right in line, but I don't really know that there's too much to do with this information. I mean, I think it's interesting that they called it all together, but it kind of fits the expectations that I would have for this audience. Protein level is fine enough. We don't need to eat any more. Carbs might trend a little bit low. And then people are taking the popular supplements we talk about all the time.
Cool. One clarification and then a question. One, the clarification, when you say 400 grams of carbs or even 800 grams of carbs, that's different than 800 grams of fruits and vegetables that we talk about a lot of time. So I just want to make sure that didn't go past people, because that would be very confusing if we keep talking about 800 grams of fruits and vegetables and then 800 grams.
Thank you for bringing that up, because sometimes when people ask about the 800 gram challenge, they'll be like 800 grams of carbohydrates. And I'm no. The 800 gram challenge is about the weight of the items. But this was specifically asking about their true carbohydrate intake. And so, traditional kind of more endurance athletes definitely push carbs way more than the CrossFit community. Yeah.
And then my question, which is, you said right at the top of that a lot of the questionnaires were focused on or asking about supplements. And we're going to get into supplements a little bit more specifically. But I'm just curious, what is the reason that they focus often on supplementation versus just food intake? Is it because that supplement companies are doing these questionnaires, or is like I'm just curious why that was such a percentage of that group that we looked at?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's just, the forever interest in supplements. I mean, gosh, if we could get some more interest in some basic nutrition habits around some whole foods and enough protein, but not too much, and enough calories, but not too much, and all that stuff, that'd be great. But it turns out that we're just way more interested in supplements. I will also say, and I think we've touched on this before somewhere, that like doing nutrition studies and interventions with supplements is certainly easier than doing diet interventions. So some of these people who want to do research may have been kind of understanding the lay of the land in terms of which supplements are of interest, and then they want to move forward with maybe a randomized control trial looking at the effect of that supplement in terms of performance. And I get it, like doing diet changes as a study is way more difficult than supplements. So, and even from a funding point of view, I think there's just a lot of things that supplements can do for us that make that research easier. Whether or not it's more valuable, I don't think so, but I just think that it's going to forever hold our attention. Yeah.
All right. We're going to talk about supplements a little bit more, but let's go back to your original list. So we did questionnaires. Let's go to interventions. What do we need to talk about as it relates to that?
Yeah. So they found a total of 7 studies that looked at dietary interventions and CrossFit performance. So, we go from 20 some frequency questionnaire studies now down to 7. Now, of course, dietary interventions are much harder to run than just asking a simple questionnaire, but nevertheless, we drop off significantly in the amount of research that's looking at true dietary interventions and CrossFit performance. 3 of those 7 were looking at more higher carbohydrate intake and what happens to performance. 3 of them were more focused on, okay, does the keto diet improve performance? That's sort of related to the first, but a little bit different. And then there was 1 of the 7 that was focused on fasting. Now, 5 of the 7 really didn't show that one diet was better than the other. So when we look across the totality of the 7 different studies, 5 of them kind of found non-significant results between whatever diet intervention it was. Maybe it was fasting, maybe it was keto, just didn't result in better performance than the participants' kind of standard habitual diet. The 2 with the better performance were diets that had higher carbohydrate intakes. So one was this experiment where the better performing group in Fran and chin-ups ate a Mediterranean diet, so lots of fruits and veggies, which I was happy to see, but 50% of the calories were coming from carbohydrates. So that's a relatively high carbohydrate diet, especially relative to some of those numbers that I said previously. And then the second one, where there was a better performance bump, was an experiment when they did these multiple days of longer AMRAP, so true kind of classic CrossFit style workouts, and the higher carbohydrate diet, closer to that 6 grams per kilo and above range that I mentioned, led to better performance, especially in the later days. So it wasn't necessarily they had better performance on day 1, but once they looked across multiple performance days, that higher carbohydrate diet won out. So suggesting in the longer term, low carb is not what you want for CrossFit.
Interesting. Could we, because of that, could we maybe double click on the keto thing a little bit? One is just your sense of like, is that a popular approach for a lot of CrossFitters? Do you have a lot of folks coming to you and saying, hey, I'm trying to improve my performance and I'm doing keto? I'm just kind of curious because I'm a little bit removed from that at this point. So is keto still sort of like a heavily favored inside of CrossFit? And then what do you get, or what should we take away from the fact that the studies with keto didn't seem to do much of anything that, of course, if you're a CrossFitter, you would like it to do?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like I'm removed a little bit from the pulse of it, but I definitely feel like there's still a heavy mindset or bias that lower carb is better. Whether or not it's going to be true keto or just lower carb, I think there's this really ingrained bias in people that carbs are bad. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's still prevalent. Like I said, do people truly mean keto or do people just mean lower carb? But I think it's definitely there. And again, keto briefly is this super low carb diet where typically about less than 5% of calories are coming from carbohydrates. So in a 2,000 calorie a day diet, that's about 25 grams of carbs or less. I mean, we're talking about you get some celery and spinach. That's about it. The balance of that is mostly coming from fat. It's not a very high protein diet. It's a very high fat diet. And when they had people do a keto diet for these 3 specific studies, the performance did not improve. And I guess you could argue, okay, well, that means that keto performed just as good as kind of the conventional or the habitual diets, which are going to be higher carb. But as I mentioned kind of at the beginning, more research needs to be done. And so I want to tease out some of the issues with these studies where keto looks kind of equivocal to like the habitual or the customary diet. And the first one is, are they really testing the right thing in terms of CrossFit performance? So we really need carbs in these short maximal intensity bursts, especially in the 30 seconds to 2 minutes, but then also longer duration efforts as well, like 10 minutes plus high intensity. But one of the studies, some of the stuff that they tested was like a 1 rep max back squat or 1 rep max power clean. Okay, neither of those rely on carbohydrates as the fuel source. 1 rep maxes really are the phosphocreatine pathway, which we shouldn't expect carb intake to make or break the difference in the performance there. So saying that keto performs just as well in those types of things, it's sort of like irrelevant, right? The more kind of true weightlifting you do, the more kind of one rep maxes you do, the less having a carb source is going to matter. The second thing about these studies, are they testing the right audience? So one of the studies that was looking at keto took individuals who had just been doing CrossFit for a month or more. This definitely means that we're going to get some people in the newbie phase where, to be honest, diet be damned in the newbie phase. You could be eating all Cheetos. Just showing up at CrossFit, you're going to see these huge, incredible gains as you learn the movements and you learn how to innervate your body and you learn some coordination. And that's really what the study found, that both groups in this study improved their performance after 6 weeks, regardless if they were in the higher carb or keto diet. And so I just don't think that's the right population to study and then make these recommendations of whether or not carbohydrates are necessary for performance in CrossFit. And then the third issue that I want to bring up, there was another study of the three that was an open labeled study without a control group. Now, open label is, you kind of have to do that with diet. It's meaning you can't really blind a group to what they're about to eat. This is where something like a supplement is much easier to mask. What are they getting? They don't really know. Where, if you do something like a keto diet or a high protein diet or an animal-based diet, they clearly see a steak, not tofu. So
Yep.
they're going to kind of figure out what's going on. And of course, this can bias the outcome. But the other problem here is they didn't have a control group. So they took this group that was willing to do the keto diet. So right there, we might have some bias and buy-in, but they tested their performance off their habitual diet or their customary diet. Then they had them go through 4 weeks of the keto diet and retested their performance, and their performance did not get better 4 weeks later. But they took everybody through that sequence. They didn't split them up and have one group kind of stay the habitual diet throughout. Now, I would generally expect in that scenario for performance to get better 4 weeks later, because people tend to get better once you're exposed to something more than once. And especially, they were testing actually FICO and BAD. So especially something like that, you can think about it as, okay, what's my strategy next time around? How am I going to break up my reps and all of that stuff? But without a control group, it's impossible to say what should have happened. Like, oh, the reps should have increased. Like, if the control group did get better, as I believe would have happened on average, then we would actually say in this case, the keto diet decreased performance potential. So in this case, it ends up looking like keto's, quote, the same as the habitual diet, when in reality, if we had a control group, we might even see that the keto led to a worse outcome, which you probably can pick up as my bias and belief, but that's why we need a control group, so we don't just kind of make these conclusions. So these are some of the limitations of the existing keto studies out there, and I get it. I'm not trying to fault the researchers, because these intervention stuff is really hard to do, especially with diets, as we mentioned, but I just don't think we have the evidence to say that keto is the recommended approach, or that even keto is just as good as the habitual diets.
A two-part question. Why do you believe carbs are feared inside of the CrossFit community, as best we can tell, or to the degree that it is? And why has keto been adopted as a viable option inside the CrossFit community? Can you identify sources for either one of those?
Well, I do think we need to cut back on carbs on average. So I think the push for lower carb is a valid one and a good one. I think, though, like a lot of things, the devil's in the details, that we don't need to go from the overconsumption of refined carbohydrates to no carbohydrates, which sort of seems where we are. And I think that's just a reflection maybe of social media, or maybe just of how we react to things, that we kind of take the extremes instead of finding that middle ground nuance, which takes a little bit more understanding. There has been a good amount of research from some groups trying to see if high-fat diets will result in better performance. It's out of the Volek and Finney group. I know they do a lot of research on high-fat diets. I'm not totally sure what the rationale for why they really got interested in it, besides the fact that they were just trying to find diets that improve performance. And for that reason, I think it's a valid reason. If you have a top athlete and you want to try to improve the performance, I think it's worth looking at all options. But so far to date, their research hasn't really shown that low carbohydrates are better, especially when we talk about high performance scenarios. If you want to take people who are race walkers, and there's a famous study about this, if you want to take people who are race walkers and they're doing something at like 60% of VO2 max, that is not what I'm talking about. That is not high intensity relative to CrossFit. If you want to take something where people at high, 80% VO2 max, then this is where carbs are going to play out time and time again as performance enhancements. So there definitely has been a lot of press around this research group trying for low carb to be better. Just the results don't show it there for a CrossFit application.
For CrossFit or for general population, you clearly don't recommend keto in either one of those scenarios. Is it worth going into more about why keto just isn't something you're going to recommend?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons why I just don't get it. I just don't get it. I mean, the first is performance.
Yep.
In these high intensity scenario, carbs are the better fuel source. Carbs can create energy without oxygen present. That's our anaerobic exercise. In that 30 seconds, 2 minutes, carbs can produce energy without oxygen. And then carbs can generate energy more quickly, even in an aerobic scenario, like I said, those 10, 20-minute AMRAPs, etc. In fact, even in a marathon, especially for our elite marathoners, the predominant fuel source is carbs. So I don't know why we keep trying to find something else that works. Like, I get it from a research perspective, but kind of from your everyday athlete, this has been shown time and time again that our top athletes in these types of scenarios are using carbs. I do think there is some attraction to keto, and that some people will see performance benefits for some confounding reasons. One is if they get weight loss. So if you take somebody and they go on keto and they lose 50 pounds, guess what's going to happen to their CrossFit performance? It's going to go up. They can run faster. They can do more box jumps. They can do more pull-ups. So there's a little bit of that some people will see some body composition shifts and therefore a quote, improve performance. But it's like, I don't think they've optimized performance based on nutrition at that point. I think they've just improved their body composition. There we go. Another one is just the training time. Again, sort of diet be damned. There is a period of time when you can literally just eat Cheetos and I'm back on the Cheetos thing. Yeah. And I don't know, soda, and you're still going to see improvements in CrossFit because the training is so powerful. And then the other thing we already hinted at is it depends on what we're testing. If you're testing a 1 rep max power clean or 1 rep max snatch, it doesn't really matter if you have a ton of carbs around. So there are these things which can kind of mask or suggest that keto is the better performing diet when we just have to understand the science and the biochemistry beneath it. But I have lots of other reasons why I don't recommend keto. The first one being sustainability. When you eat something so restrictive, you're going to cut out a lot of the foods that you like. And in fact, that last study that I cited, the one where they didn't have a control group, they mentioned the dropout rates for the study. 16 males started the keto diet and 11 finished, and 14 females started the keto diet and 11 finished, which means that basically 1 in 5 people dropped out across men and women. And I think this is something that I don't point out often enough when I'm talking about studies. Like, we can look at the results between treatments and just say it was keto better, same, or worse. But then how many people actually finished it? Because what was the difficulty of finishing the treatment? And I think that's so important because it really speaks to the real world. Like, how is this going to hold up for people? Can people actually do the thing that you want them to do? And so the big thing with keto is, are people actually going to stick to it? And I think this is a pretty high dropout rate, especially for something that's like a 4-week diet trial. Another concern for me, besides sustainability, is the lack of fiber. One of these keto trials I was looking at, the intake of fiber on average was about 8 or 9 grams of fiber per day. People need to be upwards of 25 to 30 grams of fiber. And of course, fiber comes down because that's going to be in our carbohydrate foods. And I just don't understand why people are willingly taking in such low amounts of fiber. We do all of this crazy stuff in the name of optimization, like continuous glucose monitors and I don't know, blue light blockers and all of these weird supplements, when we have so much evidence to suggest that fiber optimizes your health better than any of that. And so it's like, I would not recommend that from a long-term health perspective to have such a low fiber intake. The other thing that you're probably missing out on besides fiber is going to be vitamins and minerals. When you cut out carbohydrate sources like fruits and veggies, you're going to cut back on that. Certainly you can get some from meat, but why not just spread the net across all of the different sources that you can capture these healthy nutrients into the diet and get more vitamins and minerals that way? And so that's a big concern. Another concern is maybe your saturated fat is getting too high. And we touched on this recently in that podcast about kind of protein sources and kidney health. But when we look at the keto diet, like I said, 75% of your calories end up being from saturated fat, which means on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, this could be about 165 grams of fat a day, which easily means, because there's 3 types of fat, that upwards of like 50 grams of saturated fat a day, when at that caloric intake, it really should be closer to like 20, 22 grams of saturated fat. And the problem with saturated fat is that it can increase LDL cholesterol, which is a risk factor for heart disease. And again, I'm not against saturated fat, but there's no evidence to suggest that we should just be pushing it to these types of levels, especially for a long period of time. So, okay, we've got, it doesn't help with performance. It's not sustainable. We're potentially eliminating too much fiber. We're potentially eliminating vitamins and minerals. We might be increasing our LDL cholesterol because of all the fat. So I keep looking for the benefit. Find me the outcome where keto really is better. It's that one case where maybe the trade-off is weight loss and maybe somebody loves keto and so they get the weight loss. Okay, I can kind of get on board then. But I have other methods to drive weight loss, so I'm not even tied to keto for that. So I just don't see it from a weight, health, or performance standpoint where this is going to be a beneficial diet. Again, do I think Americans on average need to decrease carbohydrates? 100% yes. Do I think Americans need to eat keto for weight loss, health, or performance? 100% no. Especially once we consider that it could also be potentially increasing their health risk.
Okay, so we talked about the questionnaires, we talked about interventions, a little diatribe on keto there. I think the last thing we wanted to hit on was supplements, which you did talk about already a little bit. But what more is worth saying about supplements as it relates to this study that we're looking at?
Yeah, so the first part that I mentioned was about them just surveying CrossFit athletes, hey, which supplements do you take? Yep. They also looked at studies, this is the third part, where there truly was trials where they might have randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials where they gave people certain supplements and then they measured, let's say, their performance outcome. And so there's 27 studies looking at supplements in CrossFit. And I was a little surprised and also a little bit bummed, to be honest, that none of those 27 looked at creatine. One of the supplements I recommend, it wasn't even on there. And I'm not really sure why. But the results for the supplements that they did include were not that impressive. So, caffeine was tested about 5 times. Of course, that's one of the supplements I put in the worth a shot bucket. But out of these 5 trials among CrossFit athletes, only one of those 5 showed an improvement in performance. How do I explain that? Well, like I said, it's a worth a shot supplement. It's not a guaranteed outcome. I do think there could be something, again, are we testing the right things when we're doing something like a trial for caffeine and performance? One of the mechanisms for caffeine improving performance is it improves your pain tolerance. Now, certainly CrossFit is painful, but because it's shorter, is that what really is the limiting factor for athletes over, let's just say, their stamina or their cardiorespiratory endurance? To be determined. Like a lot of times where we see these performance bumps with caffeine, it's kind of the longer endurance events where the pain might start to be the problem versus the cardiorespiratory capacity. So that's something interesting to think about. And then caffeine, another way that it can bump up performance is improved alertness and focus. And I'm just kind of curious again, is the CrossFit test just not long enough where that would be the limiting factor? Like if they're doing max reps of push-ups, does the person really need more alertness and focus to get through that? Maybe not. So it might just be a misapplication of what are the tests that we're doing to see if caffeine really improves it. The second most common supplement that was studied was sodium bicarbonate, which we've talked about very briefly in our beta-alanine podcast. But basically, sodium bicarbonate is a buffer so that when you're producing a lot of acid in a high-intensity scenario, that it could neutralize that and potentially delay fatigue. But guess what? The results were mixed. Some positive, some not so positive, such that there's not a strong recommendation that this would be a good supplement to take for CrossFit. So all in all, none of the supplements out of the 27 different studies had this clear and consistent evidence to be recommended to improve performance.
Got it. Okay. Maybe do a quick takeaway, big picture. What are you thinking about as you walk away from this, looking at this paper, looking at this article?
Yeah, I mean, kind of underwhelmed. And I don't mean that in the sense of any fault to the researchers or the people who put this together. Like, it's just not a ton of research to go forward with and really recommend anything. I think we have enough evidence across various performance-centric literature to suggest that a mixed macronutrient diet is recommended, not just for the performance standpoint to get enough carbohydrates for the high-intensity scenarios, but also for all those health reasons that I mentioned. I certainly do not have any more evidence to suggest that keto should be a recommended diet approach for weight loss, health, or performance. And then, I was thinking about, because I'm saying that I'm sort of underwhelmed with the evidence, that like, what would I really want to see from a research point of view that would be helpful to be able to make kind of CrossFit specific recommendations? Of course, a longer term trial, something where it's maybe 6 months where they're following true CrossFitters, not beginner CrossFitters, and they give them a battery of tests from, the 1 rep maxes to the 20-minute AMRAPs, all the stuff that we would expect in classic CrossFit programming. And then the groups are divided between like a higher carbohydrate diet, so something in that 50% carbohydrate, to then kind of this lower moderate, not necessarily as low as keto, but maybe something in the 20% of calories coming from carbohydrates, and then see what the difference is. I have a feeling that we're not going to see much of a difference in kind of the strength outcomes, and we might see more of a difference in the longer duration events, but that's why we run the study, so that we see what shakes out.
All right. Thank you, EC. Thanks everybody out there for listening. Thank you for subscribing to the show wherever you are listening to this. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss another episode. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project Podcast.